Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a Conferencias Caribeñas 16. Esto es función principal del Instituto de Estudios del Caribe, de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales. Es difícil decir eso, Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, que casi salí como humanidades, pero que vamos a hacer esa adaptación rápidamente. Que es posible tener ese ciclo de conferencias porque tenemos apoyo de varias fuentes. Pero primero que nada quiero agradecer al doctor Humberto García, que es el director saliente del Instituto, por haber puesto que este ciclo de conferencias excelente. Yo creo que es el ciclo más ambicioso de los 16 hasta ahora y esperamos poder continuar en esa tradición. Y quiero tomar la oportunidad, como yo soy el director entrante del instituto, de saludar y dar un aplauso fuerte a la labor del doctor García. Él va a seguir con el ciclo de conferencias, porque va a haber unos días que yo no puedo estar y él va a estar haciendo esto así, pero que simplemente para que yo que doy fe de este ciclo de conferencias. También contamos con el apoyo de la decana de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales, a Rectoría, que a la Biblioteca del Caribe, de la Biblioteca Lázaro, porque estamos entonces representando todos ellos en términos de poder dar ese ciclo de conferencias. Finalmente también quiero reconocer que el departamento del programa doctoral del Departamento de Inglés y la presencia del doctor que Reinhard Sander aquí con nosotros hoy, que él va a ser el respondent y voy a hablar de él en un pequeño momento. Pero que eso entonces para como que eso es la parte institucional entonces de la invitación. Pero muy bienvenidos a ese ciclo de conferencias, y quiero mencionar también que esta noche en este mismo salón vamos a estar presentando Venezuela, la lucha sigue, que es un documental de Eduardo Aguilar, y tenemos el coauspicio de los estudiantes de comunicación pública que van a estar con nosotros, pero es un documental nuevo y que no he visto todavía, pero que entiendo que es muy impresionante, y va a estar aquí en esta sala a las 7 esta noche, también como parte del ciclo 16 de conferencias caribeñas. Bien, ok. Change. This is the second conference. The Professor Robert Hill, the Professor Emeritus of UCLA, the University of California of Los Angeles. He is the expert in the work of Marcus Garvey, and one of the people who is most expert in the study of the work of C.L.R. James. He gave his conference on Garvey yesterday, and I think most people found it to be illuminating in terms of the impact of Garvey, something we never really look at, the impact of Garvey on the development of racial policy inside the United States, just what kind of impact it had. And really something that needs to be looked at and needs to be exposed. Today, hopefully, his view on a figure who perhaps is better known inside Puerto Rico, the C.L.R. James, and especially looking at the book that still most characterizes his career, and that is the Black Jacobins. So the lecture then is C.L.R. James and the making of the Black Jacobins. So I want to just say that the Professor Hill is the editor of the papers of Marcus Garvey, and has published an impressive 2-volume work Marcus Garvey and the University Negro Improvement Association papers. Okay, the most recently the Caribbean diaspora portion of that from 1910 to 1920. He's also the compiler and editor of several essential documents: the Black Man, edited by Marcus Garvey, the Crusader, the Black Empire, and the FBI's the RACON, the racial conditions in the United States during World War II. Okay? But he's also very versed in the history of the entire Caribbean and has especially worked with C.L.R. James and the curating and editing of the C.L.R. James papers. So we have a very distinguished scholar here with us today, and we want to underline that in terms of his presence here with us. I also he also has a book recently released called "You Don't Play with the Revolution: The Montreal Lectures of C.L.R. James." So that came out in 2010. The respondent is Dr. Reinhard Sander, who is also very well versed in the writing of C.L.R. James, along with many other publications. Dr. Sander is the author of The Trinidad Awakening, a book which characterizes of the early writers, the early Caribbean writers of coming from Trinidad, and particularly those who then traveled between the Trinidad and London to form part of that initial first generation, the Caribbean diaspora of writers in London in the 1940s and the 1950s. He will respond to the talk, and Dr. Sander has taught here at the University of Puerto Rico, at the University of Pittsburgh, at Amherst College, at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He has had the staff positions in Africa and also in Germany. His PhD is from the University of Texas, Austin. Okay, so with that, I would like to welcome Professor Hill to the podium, and we'll give him a round of applause as well. That'll take that away. And I think yours comes out. Magic. Okay, so you're going to be using this one.
Greetings. Thank you for coming out. And it's a special honor to be a guest of the Institute of Caribbean Studies. It's a place that helped to inspire my career when I was a very, very young student, and getting to know the work that was emanating from Rio Piedras in the early 60s. And your journal, Caribbean Studies, has certainly been the vehicle for the development of the field of Caribbean studies throughout the world. So it's a great honor to be your guest. I'm going to be talking today, can we turn the lights down a bit? About the career of C.L.R. James, the noted Caribbean thinker and writer. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the two editions of his famous The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Overture, and the Haitian Revolution. At the outset, I want to make a number of claims about this work, because it's very important that we be clear about the stakes that are involved. Elsewhere, I have referred to the Black Jacobins as the Caribbean War and Peace. it is a work of epic proportions. The only successful slave revolution and its war of independence against the forces of the French Empire and French reaction puts it on the same plane as Tolstoy's War and Peace. In fact, many of the dramatis personae, the character of Bonaparte, is central to both the book War and Peace and to the Black Jacobins. In other words, there is something epic, Tolstoyan about this work of history. Not only a work of history, like War and Peace, it is also a towering work of literature. No one that I'm aware of who has read the Black Jacobins has ever remained the same or has been unmoved by the extraordinary, brilliant quality of the writing. In other words, the Black Jacobins is, on the one hand, a work of history, but it is also a work of towering significance in the development of literature in the Caribbean. Now, there were two, those are the making. There are two editions of this work. The first edition came out in 1938. And then the second, later edition comes out in 1963. I'm today going to try to show a comparison between the two works. And to do that for the second edition in particular, by delving deep into the archives of C.L.R. James. We can't do that, unfortunately, for the first edition because there are no archives of James from the 1930s. We don't even know where the manuscript ended up. It no longer exists. But from within the text of the first edition, we can tease out certain important threads that will provide a baseline for the discussion of the subsequent second edition. That's a photograph of James, probably from the late 1940s in America, and that's the cover of the original 1938 edition, published by Secker and Warburg in Britain. Now, James is really quite unique. James's career as a writer has two bookends, the first being the 1938 Black Jacobins. But exactly 25 years later, the same year as the second edition of the Black Jacobins, James published his book on cricket, Beyond the Boundary. These two books, The Black Jacobins and Beyond the Boundary, function as the important bookends of his writing career. And these two books are classics of Caribbean literature and writing. I don't know any other writer from the Caribbean about whom that could also be said. So James is a very special figure in the development and in the annals of Caribbean literature. This talk is entitled C.L.R. James and the Making of the Black Jacobins, 1938 and 1963. That is the title page and the photograph of Toussaint that adorns the first edition. Now, what you see here is the flap of the dust jacket of the Black Jacobins in 1938. And I want to read the section, the panel on the right. Quote, "This story has immense political significance. San Domingo, 150 years ago, occupied the same position in international politics that Abyssinia occupied in 1935. Very important. The Black Jacobins was written in the shadow of fascist Italy's invasion, occupation, and conquest of Ethiopia in 1935. The Black Jacobins was written as an intellectual literary pushback against the colonial onslaught of the 1930s. That is what gives this book its edge and its urgency, its intensity. It is, James says, British, French, and Spanish armies and diplomats all fought to gain possession of what was then the richest colony in the world. Still more significant is the internal development of the revolution. Far from being the chaotic bacchanalia of oppressed savages, the revolution followed with precision the rise and fall of the revolutionary wave in France. And the drama of Toussaint's career is played out on the surface of a social revolution unfolding with a logical completeness to be found only in the Russian Revolution of 1917. Written in the shadow of fascist Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, the book also is preoccupied with the cultural assumptions that the fascist onslaught on Ethiopia is based on, namely, that these people are savages. It is the civilizational question that has long dogged people of the so-called third world, that you are without culture, you are without enlightenment, and therefore Europe is entitled to work its will against you as a people. In other words, James is putting to use the story of the Haitian Revolution to refute the myth of cultural inferiority. Notice that in contrast to the myth of savagery, James attributes to the Haitian revolutionaries logic and precision, the two things that you don't associate with savages. James says they played out their revolutionary roles with logical completeness and with a precision that had not been seen until the Russian Revolution of 1917. So those are the stakes for James. In 1963, however, as I will attempt to show, The second edition of the Black Jacobins is revised and presented in the shadow of the Cuban Revolution. In 1938, it was Ethiopia or Abyssinia. In 1963, it is the towering significance of the Cuban Revolution that spurs James, in one sense, to extend the analysis of the Haitian Revolution, now to incorporate the Cuban Revolution. Now, this is a first example of the brilliance of the writing of the Black Jacobins. James tells us, by a phenomenon often observed, the individual leadership responsible for this unique achievement was almost entirely the work of a single man, Toussaint L'Ouverture. Bouchon, in the Biographie Universelle, calls Toussaint L'Ouverture one of the most remarkable men of a period rich in remarkable men. He dominated from his entry until circumstances removed him from the scene. The history of the San Domingo Revolution will therefore largely be a record of his achievements and his political personality. The writer believes and is confident the narrative will prove that between 1789 and 1815, with the single exception of Bonaparte himself, no single figure appeared on the historical stage more greatly gifted than this Negro, a slave till he was 45. Yet, Toussaint did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Toussaint. And even that is not the complete or the whole truth. There is a double punch there. Toussaint did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Toussaint. And then James adds, and even that is not the whole truth. When I first read that, I paused because the final sentence, and even that is not the whole truth, implies that there is what we today might call a supplément. There is some supplemental or supplementary truth behind the formulation. And I assumed that James would tell the reader, what is the supplemental truth? But he doesn't. And I have for years pondered that. Is James being simply coy? Is he teasing the reader? In other words, is he holding in reserve, saying to the reader, read on, you will find the answer? In other words, is James withholding from the reader not to give the plot away? What exactly was James's motive for leaving unstated this component of the reality that he says is necessary to fill out the picture? That's really where I enter into the unpacking of this text. I'm trying to find that supplemental truth that James leaves unstated. I think what we will see is that the answer to that question for the 1938 edition is one thing. The supplemental truth for the second or 1963 edition is another thing entirely. In other words, between these two, yoking these two editions, 38 and 63, is the presence of a meaning that changes, becomes different in the later edition. And that device analytically allows me, therefore, to play with these two editions, because it's one question posed to two distinct editions. And the search for the answers in editions is the nature of the undertaking. Are you with me? You're with me? Okay. James tells us in the first edition, those were the ideas and methods of government of Toussaint. The revolution had made him, which he tells us in the foreword. But it would be a vulgar error, says James, to suppose that the creation of a disciplined army, the defeat of the English and Spaniards, the defeat of Rigaud, the establishment of a strong government all over the island, the growing harmony between the races, the enlightened aims of the administration, it would be a crude error to believe that all these were inevitable. So James teases almost with the idea that, great as Toussaint was, he did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made him. But a few pages later, James reverses it and says, it would be nonetheless a crude error to assume that even though that was the case, Toussaint had nothing fundamental to add to the revolution. Because James says, at a certain stage, the middle of 1794, the potentialities in the chaos began to be shaped and sorted by his powerful personality, and thenceforth it is impossible to say where the social forces end and the impress of personality begin. It is sufficient that but for him, this history would be something entirely different. It is therefore essential for us to consider what sort of man he was. This becomes one of James's, as we will see in a minute, favorite rhetorical devices. He gives you one thing and then he takes it back and replaces it. It's a kind of rhetorical reversal or inversion that plays tricks with your mind, because you say, okay, I understand what James is saying, and you want to stick with that, and then James changes the scenario. Here is another example. Remember James said the crude error? This is another one. The race question is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race is disastrous. But to neglect the racial factor as merely incidental is an error only less grave than to make it fundamental. This is a stylistic, rhetorical ploy that James frequently resorts to. And it's what an imaginative writer does. The imaginative writer is always probing for the potential present in one formulation to see how it looks when you turn it in a different direction. In other words, James is a master, literary master storyteller, and he's not going to forsake the possibilities of using literary devices to bring out what is latent in the story. Now, this is a comparison of the two editions. The one on the left is the first edition, 1938, and the one on the right is 1963. What I was trying to do was to figure out what James had done in making revisions to the original text. And this is an example. I wish I had my clicker or pointer. If you look on the right, James says, if Dessalines could see so clearly and simply, it was because the ties that bound this uneducated soldier to French civilization were of the slenderest. He saw what was under his nose so well because he saw no further. His failure was the failure of enlightenment, of darkness. There again you see the rhetorical trope. Toussaint failed, but he didn't fail because of darkness. He failed because he was enlightened. Now, when you look on the panel on the left, you will see that it continues in the 1938 edition. So if you pick up from the word darkness, James pursues the idea, but it's not in the 1963 edition. In other words, James cut the passage at the word darkness, and it continues, whereas it continues in 1938. Quote, it needed another 150 years before humanity could produce and give opportunity to men who could combine within their single selves the unrelenting suspicion and ruthless ferocity necessary to deal with imperialism. That kind of ruthless suspicion and unrelenting ferocity is Dessalines. That's Dessalines. That's why Dessalines had to take control of the Haitian army, and it was he who defeated the French. But James in 38 is content to put Toussaint to the fore and, in a sense, limit the import of Dessalines. But James continues, and yet retain undimmed their creative impulse and their respect for the attainment of the very culture they fought so fiercely. Why does James leave that out, I ask, in the 1963 edition? My hunch, and I think the evidence will bear it out, my hunch is that in 1963, in fact, starting in 1957, James had embarked on what he calls the revolution in theory. Namely, how do people of the underdeveloped world make a revolution? In 1938, James had been convinced, was of the belief, that only a violent revolution could overthrow imperialism. In 1957, after James visits Ghana for the celebration of the independence of Ghana, he was personally invited by Kwame Nkrumah. James begins to revise the theory of the way forward. And when James comes back, as we will see shortly, from Ghana at the end of March 1957, he had met Martin Luther King Jr. in Ghana at the independence celebration. They did not have time to talk, but King promised that on his way back from Ghana, he would be passing through London, and mutual friends arranged for James and King to sit and talk. And then James arranged a luncheon for King and his wife, and they spent the entire day discussing the Montgomery bus boycott and the movement in the American South. James comes away from those discussions saying, the revolution does not have to be violent. I now see a way forward for the underdeveloped world and American blacks to make a non-violent revolution. My argument is that to retain that passage, it needed another 150 years. Smacked of those men of relentless ferocity and unrelenting suspicion. And James no longer, in other words, that denoted a violent revolutionary resistance to imperialism, and James no longer believed that that was strategic. You see the point? In other words, in putting forward the 1963 edition, James is editing out material that he no longer believes. Are you with me? Okay. I hope this isn't too tedious for you. Okay. James, in another passage, tells us the man, Toussaint, who so deliberately decided to join the revolution was 45 years of age, an advanced age for those times, gray already and known to everyone as Old Toussaint. Out of the chaos in San Domingo that existed then and for years to follow, he would lay the foundations of a Negro state that lasts to this day. From the moment he joined the revolution, he was a leader and moved without serious rivalry to the front, to the first rank. We have clearly stated the vast impersonal forces at work in the crisis of San Domingo, but men make history, and Toussaint made the history that he made because he was the man that he was. Now the question is, what made Toussaint the man that he was? James said he had had exceptional opportunities, and both in mind and body was far beyond the average slave. Slavery dulls the intellect and degrades the character of the slave. There was nothing of that dullness or degradation in Toussaint. By any measure, Toussaint, in James's estimation, is very, very special. So, on the one hand, the revolution unleashes vast impersonal forces, but James says, you must never lose sight of the exceptional qualities of an exceptional human being in times of revolutionary crisis. And one such figure James identifies as exceptional is Toussaint. So it's clear that though the slaves made the revolution and the revolution made Toussaint, Toussaint is still capable of making the revolution in a very specific sense. So James is carrying out this literary historical balancing act of where do the impersonal forces end and where does the exceptional human qualities of the individual end, trying to always see them in dialectical tension. Where did Toussaint get his exceptional qualities? What James argues throughout the Jacobins as a kind of subtext is that those exceptional qualities were given to him by the French Revolution and French culture. James underscores that it was the impact and the impress of the French Revolution that drove the slave revolution forward, and Toussaint was the recipient of this powerful French civilization that he took over and made his own. In some ways, there might be a literary counterpart to this, the way in which West Indians take over the language of the colonizer and turn it into this beautiful Creole speech of music and poetry and drama. In other words, James is saying the legacy of French culture, when placed in the hands of someone of such distinctive qualities like Toussaint, something new in the world, something new happens culturally. And that is what James is not prepared to say in the foreword. In other words, he's not prepared to say to the reader, sure, Toussaint was made by the revolution, but it was also the case that he was made by French culture. James is not prepared to say that, at least not so early in the text. He's holding that possibly in reserve, but James is a little bit defensive. He doesn't want the reader to say, oh, so here we go again. Everything goes back to the impact of European culture. See, James is afraid he could be misunderstood. So James wants to keep in reserve this idea. And in fact, even today, you wouldn't get away with something like that without being challenged frontally by an audience in the Caribbean. In other words, any hint that we are to some extent who we are because of European culture is something that is highly contested. Okay. In 1971, when I was at the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, we arranged for CLR James to come and give a series of lectures. And James gave 3 lectures. First one was entitled, How I Wrote the Black Jacobins. The second was how I would rewrite the Black Jacobins, and I forget the title of the third one. Now, James tells us in 1971, quote, "I had studied Marxism in order to write World Revolution, which I wrote having put aside this one," meaning the Black Jacobins. James put aside the Black Jacobins to write World Revolution. "I made a complete study of the Marxist movement, so I was very well educated in Marxism. But when I went to study the San Domingo Revolution, I had to read the great masters of history who were members of the French Revolution school. It is one of the great schools of revolutionary history in Europe. The greatest of them all is Jules Michelet. I don't know of any greater history book than his today. People have discovered a lot, but Michelet remains the great master." Well, James is a thoroughly grounded Marxist, but he tells us to write the history of Toussaint and the San Domingo slave revolution, I had to read and study and master the fruits of French historiography, the great school of the French historical masters. In my book, James continues to what that school meant. So that I really got hold of historical development. Plus, I had read Marxism and had to study Marxism first to know what the quarrel between Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin was about, what were their differences. Then I began to apply Marxism to the San Domingo Revolution. I studied the San Domingo Revolution and began to read the great school of the French Revolution. By the time I come to write about the French Revolution in San Domingo, I am a pretty well-educated person in history and politics. I didn't fall from the sky. I didn't go up like Moses and come back with the documents. I had to work at it, and I worked at it with great pleasure and passion because I was learning from it all the time. What I want to suggest to you is the thing that gives the Black Jacobins its amazing historical persuasiveness, its vision, its intensity, is what James took over from the French Revolutionary School of writers. In the bibliography of the 1963 edition, there is an entire section subtitled The French Revolution. And James says, "The crown of this work for over a century has been attained by Monsieur Georges Lefebvre, whose one-volume history of the Revolution and his mimeographed series of lectures to students at the Sorbonne are a fitting climax to a lifetime of indefatigable scholarship, sympathetic understanding, and balanced judgment of all parties, groups, and individuals in the Revolution, which it would be difficult to parallel." Now, James isn't saying this. That's a photograph of Georges Lefebvre. And that's the Sorbonne, where Lefebvre taught and delivered his lectures on the French Revolution. I happened to find the mimeograph lectures of Georges Lefebvre in James's library. And this will give you an idea of how intensely James worked at annotating and incorporating Lefebvre's ideas. Look at that page. I mean, James is defacing the page, and you can see his excitement with the multiple lines in the margins. Well, I wouldn't even begin to decipher James's notations because they're so encoded. Those are covers of two of Lefebvre's published works on the French Revolution. James continues in the bibliography on the French Revolution. I have sought all through to show the direct influence of the revolution on events and leading personalities in San Domingo. On page 338, I have given a quotation from Monsieur Lefebvre, and elsewhere I have tried to show the close parallels, hitherto unsuspected, which can be found between events in two populations so widely separated and so diverse in origin and composition. Studies of events in France and in San Domingo will not fail to unearth more. That's page 338, and that entire footnote is a quotation that James has incorporated from Georges Lefebvre. Now, adopting James's strategy, or discursive, we would say today, discursive strategy, James tells us that Toussaint did not make the revolution, it was the revolution that made Toussaint. Borrowing from James, I add to that, CLR James did not make the Black Jacobins. It was the Black Jacobins that made CLR James. It was the Black Jacobins that made CLR James the man and the historian and the literary master that we have come to know. But I add, even that is not the whole truth. Because it was the French revolutionary school of historiography, in addition to the revolutionary achievements of Toussaint and the Haitian slaves, that made CLR James. James tells us the French Revolution was not only a tremendous event in history, which in my opinion is still the greatest historical event in the last 1,000 years of history. The French, not the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. In other words, all throughout this, James is leaning on the French Revolutionary School of historiography to take the story to a new height. Without the example and the inspiration of the French Revolutionary historians, James could not have written the Black Jacobins, not in the way that he did. Then in 1977, a bombshell hits James. He receives a letter from Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and it's dated the 23rd of January, 1957, from the Prime Minister's office. Nkrumah says, "Dear James, I am enclosing herewith a formal invitation to the ceremonies which will be held in Accra between the 2nd and 10th March to mark the attainment of independence by the Gold Coast under the name of Ghana. It would give me great personal pleasure if you should be able to attend." This comes out of the blue. James wasn't expecting it. And now, in fact, James was working on his book on cricket. He was working on his book on the Hungarian Revolution. He has to drop all of that quickly because the letter comes near the end of January. It reaches him in London, and James says, I am going. I have to go. James goes out to Ghana, and as soon as he returns from Ghana in March, he writes to his American comrades. In fact, even before he leaves Ghana, he's still in Ghana when it's written. On March the 11th, the letter says, "As soon as I get back, I shall mobilize all forces and do the book on Ghana. I have it all very clear in my mind." So James goes to Ghana and he promises Nkrumah, "I will write you a book on the Ghanaian Revolution such as never been attempted." Well, James had already written one book on a black revolution, the revolution of the slaves of San Domingo. James is now going to try to repeat the feat, a book that will reprise the black Jacobins, but this time for Ghana. And this is where the second edition, the idea of the second edition is born. It is in James's attempt to prepare a revolutionary history of the Ghana Revolution that James begins to revise his study of the Haitian Revolution. In that same letter, James says, "Last night, a close ally of N, meaning Nkrumah, came to my room and told me the inside story of the split in the national movement. It is Hegel and Shakespeare. You will get it soon." And then he says, "Tonight I go with the members to wait until midnight. When the British flag goes down, the Ghana flag goes up. I shall keep the vigil. In 1834, West Indian slaves sat up all night waiting for the dawn, which meant freedom. I shall see this one in, and then I shall do a book on it, which will ... Can you imagine? That's the Ghana national flag. Can you imagine what it meant to James to have been present the night the flag of Ghana's freedom was hoisted? James compares it with the night before abolition in the West Indies. That is an 1833 illustration of former slaves celebrating their emancipation in Barbados. James comes back to London, and on March 20th, he writes to his American comrades, "I propose to postpone the Hungarian pamphlet for 4 to 6 weeks and do instead a 70,000-word book on Ghana. Why? The structure of the book. Why?" James to elaborate, but the thing I want to stress is the third paragraph at the bottom. He says, 2, "I propose to review past writings, particularly black Jacobins. I shall quote and show how clearly the future was foreseen there, when practically everybody then thought we were crazy." He tells them, "Read these pages. I shall draw the argument to a head." 3, "I shall review Nkrumah's book and break completely with, or rather develop qualitatively, the theoretical premises of the black Jacobins and the Leninist theory of the colonial revolution. The African Revolution as a process is no longer to be seen as supplementary to or subordinated to the revolution in Western Europe. I shall examine it in relation to the French Revolution, the Russian, the Chinese, and the Hungarian. So James is announcing that he's going to break with the theoretical premises of his own black Jacobins. And by breaking with it, he says, I'm going to develop them qualitatively. And by qualitatively, James says, hello, in 1938, I had to think the Haitian Revolution in relation to the hoped-for revolution in Western Europe, but not anymore. The African Revolution has begun a new process of historical temporality. A new process of historical change has been set in motion. But James has at his back the legacy and the precedent of the black Jacobins. And it is those precedents that James would now set about not dismantling, but extending. Because the Ghana Revolution has pointed to a new horizon of possibility. Okay, so James meets Dr. Martin Luther King in Ghana, and he says to his folks, he tells them, I am working also on the black Jacobins. You will note that at last the two strands which I have worked on for the last 20 years, beginning with the black Jacobin World Revolution, have at last merged quite naturally into one. Please remember that the last part of the book is going to pose very sharply the enormous difficulties which face Nkrumah and the CPP. He expects me to do so because I have told him that in no uncertain terms. While he is in Ghana, James has an experience which has a profound impact on James. James met with some young South African revolutionaries while he is in Ghana. And these South Africans tell him that we have read the black Jacobins in South Africa, and we transcribe portions of it, particularly the chapter on the relationship between the black slaves and the coloreds, and distributed it almost like a samizdat in South Africa. And this would have been the 1940s and 1950s. And they tell James that it was a white teacher, it was probably at Fort Hare College, a white teacher who, go and look at James's book, it's in the library. And James says, they typed out copies, mimeographed them, and circulated passages from the black Jacobins dealing with the relations between the blacks and the mixed in Haiti. I could not help thinking that revolution moves in a mysterious way its wonders to perform. What I am arguing is that the year 1957 is the turning point. 1957, because it sends James to Ghana, where he's now testing the ideas of the black Jacobins against the new reality of the Ghana Revolution and African independence, that James begins to rethink the premises of the Jacobins. On March 25th, James writes, Yesterday, the Reverend Luther King and his wife had lunch with us and stayed here from 12:30 until nearly 5 p.m. Can you imagine that? A man as busy as Martin Luther King, he gets to James's house at Staverton Road and he just kicks back and he stays till 5:30. With us was George Lamming, the West Indian writer who has just received a distinguished literary prize, the Somerset Maugham Award of £500 for his book, In the Castle of My Skin. The award demands that the winner must travel, and he's going to Ghana. There was also with us Dr. David Pitt. After about 2 hours of general conversation, Luther King and his wife began to speak about the events in Montgomery, Alabama. I shall include a chapter on their experiences in the book on Ghana. And as I give you an account here of what he said, I shall introduce one or two parallels from the Ghana experiences. The more I look at this, the more I see that they are in the heart of a new experience which demands the most serious analysis. So the book on Ghana is going to fuse the Black Jacobins, the story of the Ghana Revolution, and the Montgomery, Alabama struggle. Wow, this is now, James is beginning to see how this whole thing of new political struggles that have emerged on the world scene now fuse into one. Here is what Dr. King tells him. One Thursday, on a day in December, a woman was arrested for traveling on the bus in a seat reserved for white people. In Montgomery, Alabama, the woman resisted, and to this day, she says, she does not know why she did. Thousands of Negroes had obeyed the regulations for many years. A local trade union leader went down and bailed her out and called up Dr. King, suggested that they should, quote, do something. King, in other words, relates to James at his home in London the inside story. Most people at this time, and for many years later, did not know how the Montgomery bus boycott had come about. James gets the story firsthand from Dr. King. Those are images of the bus boycott. James gets this story firsthand and is fired to realize the incredible importance of what has happened in the U.S. Deep South. On the 13th of April, 1 month later, James writes again, the book on Ghana, including as an integral part the Montgomery struggle and the struggle of the Negroes in the USA. The book will not be simply on Ghana, but will trace back to the role of past writings, particularly Black Jacobins, and how what was posed there helped the African movement. That's the cover, the book cover of James's eventual book on the Ghana Revolution, Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. Now, the panel on the right is the table of contents page, and I don't know if you can see it. Chapter 4 is called The Revolution in Theory, and that is where James describes how in the writing, the stage of the 1938 Black Jacobins, they believed in armed revolution as the sole strategy with which to confront imperialism. James says, Let me explain how we now have to revise that strategy. And James goes through it. He says, the theoretical basis of the book, amply demonstrated, is that in a period of worldwide revolutionary change, such as 1789 to 1815, and our period, which began with 1917, the revolutionary crisis lifts backward peoples over centuries and projects them into the very forefront of the advanced movement of the day. The slaves in San Domingo were 2/3 raw Africans from the Guinea coast in a strange country, many of them not knowing the language. Yet with the example and slogans of the French Revolution, these for the most part illiterate blacks organized themselves in a manner fully compatible with the great achievements of the movement in France, produced a body of great leaders in politics and administration, differentiated among themselves in clear alignments of right, left, and center, and all in all showed themselves immensely superior in every human quality to the highly educated colonial officials in France who ruled them. But the book had other premises, raising urgent questions which had to be readily revised and are by no means settled. It took armed rebellion for granted as the only road to metropolitan and colonial freedom, and from this premise flowed certain theoretical perspectives. The San Domingo Revolution had been directly inspired by the French Revolution, had developed side by side with it, and had had an enormous influence upon the course of that revolution. The book therefore constantly implied that the African Revolution would be similarly contingent upon the socialist revolution in Europe. Not only is that not going to happen, but a violent rebellion is, for that reason, no longer on the cards. 1 year later, a second bombshell hits James. He receives an invitation to the opening of the Parliament, the inauguration of the Parliament of the West Indies Federation. James is in Spain, in Mallorca, writing the Black Jacobins when he gets the invitation. Fortunately, he has finished the Black Jacobins, and he borrows £200 from a friend and heads to Trinidad. James went to attend the inauguration of the federal parliament. He said he was tired. He wanted to go home. He had not seen his family since 1932. It is now 1958. He said, I miss my home. And he goes back, intending to stay just for the celebrations. In the end, James spends the next 4 years in the Caribbean. While in Trinidad, James becomes involved in the Trinidad National Movement and teams up with Eric Williams and becomes the editor of the party's newspaper, The Nation. This is a photograph of the famous Chaguaramas March, because one of the chief, if not the leading demand of the Trinidad National Movement is the recovery and regaining control of the American base at Chaguaramas. That's a photograph of the base and some American sailors having some young men shine their shoes. As most of you know, while in Trinidad during this hectic period, James and Williams split. According to James, Eric Williams, the Prime Minister, reneged on the commitment to demand and achieve the of the basic shagaramas from the Americans. It's a very bitter, complicated split between these two men who had known each other. James had taught Eric Williams at school in Trinidad. And Williams's book, his famous book, Capitalism and Slavery, the thesis of it, James had written out and given to Eric Williams while Williams was a student at Oxford. In fact, the thesis is squarely present in the pages of the Black Jacobins. So the relationship between them could not have been closer. When the split came in 1960, James is stranded in Trinidad. He is beached. He has no income. He has no means of support. He's left high and dry. It is at this point that he says, I have to set about earning some income. And it is then that James now sets about trying to get a publisher to reissue the Black Jacobins. And James contacts the editor, Maurice Philipson, at Random House in New York. And Random House, he sends them a copy of the Jacobins, and Random House says, you've got a deal. That's how the second comes about. But since Eric Williams is known as the master historian because of his classic work, Capitalism and Slavery, James is not unmindful, I don't think. After all, he was not naive. James is not unmindful that to fight Williams in Trinidad, you have to fight him on the terrain of the book. You have to fight him, in other words, on the terrain of history. So what issues is this gigantic battle of the books? Capitalism and Slavery versus the Black Jacobins. That's the cover of a later reprinting of the second edition alongside the cover of the first edition. Now, what distinguishes, apart from certain textual changes in the text, one of which I've illustrated earlier, the major innovation in the text is the addition of the appendix from Toussaint L'Ouverture to Fidel Castro. In the preface to the 1963 edition, James says, quote, the appendix from Toussaint L'Ouverture to Fidel Castro attempts for the future of the West Indies, all of them, what was done for Africa in 1938. Writers on the West Indies always relate them to their approximation to Britain, France, Spain, and America, that is to say, to Western civilization, never in relation to their own history, is here attempted for the first time. Where have you heard that before? Isn't that what James had said in 1957 when he came back from Ghana? The relation of Africa to Western civilization. James says no, it has to be related to Africa. In other words, James is carrying to the West Indies the insight he had brought back with him from Ghana in 1957. That's point number one. But it is in the Caribbean that James is writing under the impact of the recently successful Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution comes to power New Year's Eve or New Year's Day of 1959. So James is in Trinidad, and he now realizes we have to write we have to think of a Caribbean version of the Black Jacobins for a new Caribbean. Moreover, James believed that the reason that the West Indies Federation had collapsed and died was because the leaders in the Caribbean had no historical vision of this region with which to carry out the political revolution that was necessary. In other words, James is saying, let this appendix from Toussaint to Fidel Castro be the source of a political inspiration for a new Caribbean. Those are pictures from the taking of power in Cuba. But if the appendix and the new edition is being conceived in the shadow of the new Cuban Revolution, the hero of the appendix is Aimé Césaire. It's very obvious to me, and I think when you see the evidence, you will agree, that it is to the figure of Césaire, Aimé Césaire, the poet, that James now turns. In the appendix, James says, in 1939, a black West Indian from the French colony of Martinique published in Paris the finest and most famous poem ever written about Africa. Aimé Césaire first describes Martinique, the poverty, misery, vices of the masses, etc. He does so and discovers a new version of what the Haitians at Hadgarvey and Padmore had discovered, that salvation for the West Indies lies in Africa, the original home and ancestry of the West Indian people. You hear echoes of James's exposure to the Ghana Revolution, because now this is not just a nostalgia for Africa. James is linking the political lessons of the Ghana Revolution with the urgent, exigent needs of the Caribbean people. All through the appendix, the person that James is looking to as a point of departure for rethinking the Caribbean is Aimé Césaire, not Marx. James is a Marxist, but now he realizes history has moved on. The book on Ghana also contains an extensive discussion in its pages of Aimé Césaire. And James says, in this poem, Césaire makes a place for the spiritual realities of the African way of life in any review and reconstruction of the life of modern man. Césaire's whole emphasis is upon the fact that the African way of life is not an anachronism, a primitive survival of history, even of prehistoric ages, which needs to be nursed by unlimited quantities of aid into the means and ways of the supersonic plane, television, the Beatles, and accommodation to the nuclear peril. Césaire means exactly the opposite. It is the way of life which the African has not lost, which will restore to a new humanity what has been lost by modern life. In other words, James is in the Caribbean, having come from Ghana, and he says, the model of economic, the model of modernization can only lead to calamity. We have to rethink that process, that entire bankrupt process. And he says, Césaire points out that in Africa, and by extension in the Caribbean, are the resources for us to develop another way, another path. That sounds exactly like what New World and Lloyd Best and McIntyre, people here at the Institute of Caribbean Studies, embarked upon in the 1960s. But James is no longer in Europe, writing from London, from Staverton Road. James is in the Caribbean, trying to rethink, what can I carry into this new epoch that's still relevant? In other words, the second edition is inspired not so much by the French Revolutionary School of historiography, but by the example of Ghana and Aimé Césaire. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Wow. I'm very happy to finally meet you in person after many, many years that we... Oh, like that? I'm very happy that I finally get a chance to meet you in person after having corresponded with you, I guess, when I was in Nigeria and stuff. And if I remember correctly, it all had to do with you being the literary advisor to Krauss reprint.
Yes.
And I was very much involved in, and that's the direct relationship to CLR James, in the reprinting of some of the early magazines. And the most important one was The Beacon. And some of the early short stories that CLR James wrote were in that magazine. And so that's also a facet that I guess a lot of people focus on CLR James as an activist, historian, etc. But he was probably the pioneer of Caribbean literature, not only in the Caribbean as a whole. And that's, I guess, where I come in as a member of the English department. My focus is on, it's on literacy, cultural studies at the same time. But and anyway, I guess you and me or whatever, we all succeeded in getting The Beacon reprinted in addition to some of the real famous local magazines like BIM, BIM from Barbados, Focus from Jamaica. I'm not sure whether Kaiko overall finally made it, but so I mean, I'm very happy to finally meet you. And I mean, I don't even know how to run. This was really, really impressive, and it actually shows. And I know there are some of the students in the room, what kind of research you can do if you have access to archives, right? The CLR James archives. A lot of this, the things that you brought out, you couldn't talk about if you didn't have access to letters with the Kuma and et cetera. That's obviously a new form of, and I hope, I don't know, has that already been digitalized now, the CLR James archive? Well, I hope that it could be one of your projects to do that. Anyway, when Lowell asked me if I would be willing to respond, I said, oh my God, that brought me back on, really memory lane. Way back when I was a graduate student at the University of Texas. And so I looked around and of material that I could use to respond. And I came across this collection, I think you know about that, which was called an interview collection, Cus Interviews with 3 Caribbean Writers in Texas, with a fellow student, published in 1972. And it has interviews with 3 people, and they were the most important people, actually, Caribbean writers, that basically led me to get interested in Caribbean literature and Caribbean studies in general, namely George Lemming, Wilson Harris, and CLR James. So some of the stuff I just want to, it's mostly adding to what you have said or proving some of the points that you have said. His visit to Texas was in 1972. Now that's like 28, it's like 40 odd years, right? I was much younger then. And he was invited for, this was also typical by that time, he had already become famous outside the circles of the radical left and the Caribbean. And he attended a symposium that was organized in Texas, and it was called the 21st Century. And it was, I think he was the only black intellectual in that august meeting at Texas. But his speech was just fantastic. And then he followed to come to some of our classes, a Caribbean, and a lot had to do with George Lemming's In the Castle of My Skin. And I guess a couple of questions sort of were directly related to that. But initially, I think it was George Lemming who drew my attention to both Black Jacobins and capitalism and slavery. I mean, that's how I discovered these, and I just read them. And Black Jacobins, and I think I appreciate what you said, I mean, that reads like War and Peace, reads like a novel. I mean, he has all the literary talent that he had before in short story writing. He transferred that to the historical book. Anyway, so I can't remember now who asked those questions. Some we asked as the professor, the teaching assistant at that time, others were students. But since we had discussed In the Castle of My Skin, if some of you remember, that deals with the uprisings in the Caribbean in the late 30s, 80s, one of us asked them and said, did your historical work, the Black Jacobins, have any influence on the events in the Caribbean during the late 1930s? Obviously a very naive question about the direct impact of a book. It had just come out in 1938, right? I mean, so he obviously said, no, it didn't. The Black Jacobins was published before that, I think. I was able to refer to that wave of riots in A History of Negro Revolt that came out the same year, but late in the year. However, the Black Jacobins was influential, and I think that sort of substantiates what you were talking about, in the African Revolution. Many of the African leaders and the young men that read that book, I know they did. They told me so. There was nothing else which gave them the direction of a revolutionary struggle. That's why I wrote it. And they responded to that. It had an influence on Caribbean politics much later. Caribbean politics were very peculiar. In 1937-38, that's the time of the upheaval, then the British sent out a commission in 1939. The war came, so that what the commission recommended could only be put into 1945. Up to 1945, only 5% of the British population in the Caribbean had the vote. So things only began in 1945. When the movement towards self-government began, a lot of West Indians read the Black Jacobin and said it meant a lot to them. But it didn't mean much to them in 1938. From 1938 on, the African people were reading it. There was Jomo Kenyatta, there was Kwame Nkrumah. It was in the United States in 1930. I was in the United States in 1938, and Nkrumah read the book, and we talked about it. Most of the African politicians read it, and A History of Negro Revolt. They read them because there was little else to read. So that would, fall in line with what Professor Hill said about the impact initially was on African independence, African politics, and the Caribbean came in much later with the thing. I thought that, when I was reading it later on. So then we followed it up with, what did African leaders learn from Toussaint Louverture? They learned that Toussaint was a man who mobilized himself for the revolution, that Toussaint decayed, and that ultimately Dessalines had to carry it through. Now this is interesting because some of it isn't quite in line again, how you, the take you putting on him. Only now people are beginning to see the importance of that as they see the decline in Africa among those who led the revolution. So it's a very like a post-independence evaluation of what's going on in 1971. Now I'm beginning to point out, and they are beginning to see, that there is a certain inherent tendency to decay among those who lead the revolution. So there is a much more, at that point at least, 71, and you respond again, figure out what is special about that particular year. This is a year before you said he came to UCLA to your conference, right? You said, didn't you say that he came in 1972 at the very beginning? That he participated in a symposium?
No, he came to UCLA, but I didn't mention.
You didn't mention the year?
Oh, in 71, at the Institute of the Black World in 1971. Yes, yeah.
So this is almost the same time.
That was in Atlanta. Yes.
At UCLA. Oh,
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we followed it up then with, what then were Toussaint's weaknesses? He was overwhelmed by gratitude with the fact that France had declared the emancipation of slaves. Nobody else had. And he had been reading a bit, and he looked upon French civilization as the basis of all that he knew, all that they had done, and he couldn't make the break with France on account of that. He wanted all the time to fight slavery, but still not to break with France, because he knew the backwardness of the population, and French civilization represented the be-all and end-all of his ideas. Dessalines could carry it through because he was a barbarian, and he thought the best Frenchman was a dead Frenchman. That was all. But Dessalines would never have been able to do it if Toussaint had not laid the foundation of a social structure and an army. I thought that was interesting, and would bring also a different perspective on that. Now, in that particular context, I always love, in teaching Caribbean literature, love to teach the English translation of Alejo Carpentier, El Reino de este Mundo. I don't know how many of you in the audience have read that book, but it is an absolutely fascinating contrast to Black Jacobins and to other academics, historians, who point out the relationship between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. And that novel, I think, makes a point that there are definitely aspects to people like C.L.R. James that are essentially, even if radical, Eurocentric. Right? What Alejo Carpentier's novel does, it uses a trick. It's basically a novel that depicts Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, before, during, and after the revolution. And it establishes a tradition that is counter the analysis that ultimately it is again a European idea, a European movement that sparked the Haitian Revolution, right? So what it does, there is no Toussaint Louverture in that novel. Toussaint Louverture is left out on purpose. So first of all, it goes back and sees a continuation of uprisings from a person called Macandal in like the mid-18th century, then renewed in when is the outbreak, 1791, with actually another person from outside, Boukman, I think he's originally from Jamaica, and then Toussaint Louverture joins, but that joins the revolution a year later in 1792, sorry about that. But he is not mentioned in the novel at all. And then the second part is actually a person who is not a historical person, T. Noel, is an old man who lives throughout about 100 years, so covers the whole span, goes with his plantation owner into exile into Cuba. So during the whole stretch of the revolution from 1792 to 1803, nobody is in Haiti, because the person who basically, through whose eyes you see everything, is in Cuba. I mean, it's just beautiful how Alejo Pacandia mentions that. Then he comes back, and Henri Christophe has taken over. So you don't really know what happens until you hear about Dessalines, right? But then the third part is absolutely showing you the kind of despotic regime that the king has been able to establish, and then the revolt against him. Now, the whole issue of that is that Alejo Carpentier is trying to make the point, the counterpoint to, it was the French Revolution that sparked the revolution. He says, no, no, no. It was Africa. Africa, and particularly African religion in the form of voodoo, that is responsible for that. So throughout the whole novel, you see the impact of voodoo, and the uprising against Henri Christophe is also basically masterminded by the voodoo priest. It's a similar scene that you have in the beginning when the voodoo priests initiate the first uprising. Boukman, they celebrate actually in some forest. So that's a scene that actually you also find in C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. So I was just trying to bring that in. It always immediately comes to mind. I love the Black Jacobin, and the focus that he brings, and basically the tragedy, this kind of tragic figure. You have that quotation, I can't remember that exactly now, that Dessalines was this and this, and the tragedy of Toussaint Louverture was that he was too right. But that also meant that he was too close to the French Revolution, too European for the whole process. I have some other things to say, but I would like to first see how you respond to that, because this is not now a critique by a European in the way of basically whatever dismissing the revolution, but actually saying, hey, this is a European interpretation. And then you have James talking in many of the interviews, but also in Beyond the Boundary, where he always says, I am the man of the West. My education has been Western. Everything I know, I've learned from the West. And my radicalism is also based in thought, right? You also had a reference to, to Lefebvre with the French Revolution. Again, that's a French intellectual. But I found it then fascinating when you brought in the visit to Ghana, where he now brings in, and some of the rewriting has to do with the impact that events in Africa have had. I have a whole other point that I want to bring up, but I would be interested in how you deal with, a major Cuban writer who did the same thing, 1949. Everything was clear. This revolution in Cuba was going to happen, right? And it's almost like a warning of make sure that the leadership will not end up with somebody like Henri Christophe in Cuba.
Mm. Well, following on what you say, which I am very grateful to hear, you could say that the 1963 edition of the Black Jacobins, with its appendix from Toussaint L'Ouverture to Fidel Castro, with the key figure of Aimé Césaire, brings James in alignment with Alejo Carpentier. And it's interesting that James had to return to the Caribbean and himself fail in his political odyssey in the Caribbean, and was therefore forced to really think through the reasons for the political demise of the independence project, which is just getting off the ground, and already it's showing signs of bankruptcy and decay. In other words, from within the reality of the Caribbean in crisis, under the shadow of both the Cuban Revolution, under the shadow of a revivified, virulent imperialism, James is forced to think, where do we go from here? What path do we pursue in the Caribbean? And I would argue that that's a function of James's return to the Caribbean, rediscovering the Caribbean, and that brings him in to alignment with Carpentier. But for the first edition, you're right. James is really not offering a vision of the Caribbean from within the Caribbean.
Thanks. Then I then started working during in the early 70s under the impact of C.L.R. James and George Fleming. I started working on those magazines, and particularly then on the kind of creative writing that James had done, and fellow Trinidadians, Alfie Mendes, and somebody called Ralph de Boissier, who is not that well known. Now, at that point, I discovered that C.L.R. James had written a play which was entitled Toussaint L'Ouverture. And it was basically unavailable. Now, at that point, when you respond later on, I wonder is the original in the archives? At that point, I didn't have access to that. So what I wrote here, and I just quote that, it's much faster. First of all, James said when he moved that's 1932, when he moved from Trinidad to England, he said fiction writing, he'd written a major novel which is called Minty Alley, about a young intellectual who lives in the barrack-yard and has a hole in the wall, and he's just fascinated, especially by the women, again, in the barrack-yard, what's going on there, how they make their money. So when he moved to England, he said, fiction writing drained out of me and was replaced by politics. I became a Marxist, a Trotskyist. I published large books and small articles on these and kindred subjects. I wrote and spoke. Like many others, I expected war, and during or after the war, social revolution. Actually, what I made my thesis, I make the point, it's not really true, because even the Black Jacobins reads, and I fully agree, reads like War and Peace. I mean, it's a great novel, in a sense, except it is a historical. I mean, it doesn't qualify as a historical novel either, but it definitely is it's one of the books when you take it up, you finish reading it in one go. I mean, there's no way. I haven't heard of anybody who starts reading it who isn't absolutely fascinated by that. So then I say in England, so that isn't true, what he says. In England, James wrote one further literary work, a play entitled Toussaint L'Ouverture. It was written in 1936, and I point that out, 2 years before the Black Jacobins. and presented in the same year by the London Stage Society in a special performance with Paul Robeson. I mean, that is when you come across something like that and say, wow, these people, you know, how they all meet each other in exile. You know, one of the most famous black actors ever, Paul Robeson in the lead role, obviously playing Toussaint Louverture. It preceded the publication of James' major historical study, The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture, and the San Domingo Revolution by 2 years. Okay, then I just say that this is, in fact, again, that might be added to, if you, or I don't know whether you have published this thing, added to your thing, that there is another predecessor to that. While still in Trinidad, James had become interested in Toussaint Louverture and his role in the first successful slave uprising in the Caribbean. His earliest comments on the Haitian leader appeared in an article in that magazine I mentioned, The Beacon, entitled The Intelligence of the Negro, A Few Words with Dr. Harland. Dr. Harland was some professor at the university, or the college, whatever, Tropical Institute there, who was a real race measuring, you know, that what they used to do, measuring the size of brains and all that kind of stuff. And so James has his rebuttal, and he said, this is all crap, because, you know, look what C.L.R. James has achieved. We didn't measure his thing, but it's, yeah, what is this? So that's the first he wrote about Toussaint Louverture. So he attacked Dr. Harland's article on the intellectual inferiority of the Negro race. This happened in 1931, 1 year before he goes to England and then starts writing the big book. Mentions that instead of arguing with people like Dr. Harland, he would have far preferred to write on Toussaint Louverture. Okay, now the play that he wrote of 1936 was his first attempt to present Toussaint's rise and decline. And in my whole analysis is also that this is, and it is a play of the rise and decline. I mean, it has the classical structure of that. I mean, we don't have time now to do that. Maybe I can do that as a separate talk at some point. And was probably a byproduct of, not just probably, but now definitely a byproduct of his research on the Haitian Revolution for his book, The Black Jacobins. The original version of the play was never published, and no copies of it were available when I did my research. And I'm curious if there is something like that in the archives.
Now been published.
The original?
Yes. We found the original play script, and it's published last year.
Ah, okay. So I missed out on that.
Duke University Press in the C.L.R. James Archives, a series that I'm editing for Duke University Press.
Great. So one can look at that now.
Yeah, it's now available.
Version, which was published about 15 years ago, is the revised version from the 1960s.
Yes.
So that's the version that I teach and that has been available for us here for the last 15 years roughly.
The play was actually written in 1934, not 1936, and performed in 1936.
Okay. Oh, okay. No, good.
And it's now available.
I mean, at that point, it was like total something new. Nobody had ever heard of it and stuff. And obviously now this thing. But as you said, it was the revised version was published in Errol Hill's collection, A Time, ... and a Season 8 Caribbean in 1976. And this is just when I was involved in writing my thing, right? Yeah. So this just came in, and it was, wow, I have to add a whole section now on the play, because I was hesitant at that point to write about the Black Jacobins, even though I always said this reads like a novel. But you know, I mean, you know the narrow-mindedness of English department professors, right? You stick with literary text. I mean, I've changed my mind in the meantime, but the new version was first produced by Dexter Lindersay at Nigeria's University of Ibadan during the Nigerian Civil War, right? Which is 69, 67 to 71 or something. Anyway, so it has a very interesting history. It has not been possible to assess the differences between the original and the revised version of the play. James has merely stated, and this almost reminds me of what you said, after 25 years, the colonial revolution had made great strides. So about that time, I began to rewrite it in view of the new historical happening. So one could actually do the same kind of analysis or the same kind of talk now about the original play and the revisions and talk about what made him revise. But he already gives you the clue now. You know, it has something got to do with external events, like, you know, independence movement, his change in ideology and all that. Would be a fascinating project for, you know, whatever, either a thesis or a capstone paper, you know, or something like that. I just want to just quickly indicate, and then I'll stop, just indicate what the play is, how the play works, and I want to work out there. It's one character, and again, I was thumbing through my book of Black Jacobin, whether that's a character of which James makes a lot in the Black Jacobins, because he almost becomes a major character in the play. Anyway, just sort of a quick summary of the play. I think what you find in the play in general is maybe a simplification, but definitely a condensed version of James's, whether it's in the first version, which I haven't had access to, or only of this version, of what his main slant on the Haitian Revolution is, without having to go through 300 pages, you know, in a play. And obviously, because it is a play that, you know, has different, has to achieve different things, and it isn't exactly the greatest play in the world either, right? A dramatist would, after reading that, would say, yeah, it's interesting, it's a play of ideas, but, you know, there was a revolution, but there's hardly any action happening in the play itself, right? Okay, I just give you that quickly. James divides his play into 3 acts. The dramatic division reflects 3 recognizable stages in the historical development of Haiti, from colonial status to independence in 1803. The first act covers the period 1791, when he joins. No, he joins in 1792, to 1798, and focuses on 3 major events. Toussaint Louverture to join the 1791 slave uprising, the sudden end of his alliance with the Spanish when France abolishes slavery in 1794, and his victory over the British and mulatto forces in 1798, which establishes his position as governor of French Santo Domingo. The second highlights the growing conflict between Toussaint and Bonaparte in the closing years of the 18th century. Enraged by the ex-slaves' audacity in publishing a new Haitian constitution guaranteeing the island's self-governing dominion status, that's my interpretation, that what his main idea was, no break with France. And I think that's what's this weakness. You know, there's no, I mean, that's not just mine, but lots of other people have said that's his weakness. He didn't want to break with France. Yeah. You know, there are lots of other people in other places that I'm familiar with who don't want to break with the mother country.
That's precisely what I'm fascinated by in listening to both of you, is that like Fanon, like Frantz Fanon, another Martinican, C.L.R. James' ideas had more influence in the independence of Africa than in the independence of the Caribbean. And one of the things I say in the essay I was talking to you about in the comparison between Cuba and Haiti is that if you look at it, Toussaint was not for independence. Toussaint was the consul of Saint-Domingue writing to the consul of France. And it was a dominion. He never thought of independence. The other great figure in terms of C.L.R. James is Aimé Césaire. Aimé Césaire was a communist that was not for the independence of Martinique. And this is something that I am wondering now. I don't know if I'm asking a question, but I would like a reaction from you, which is that when you look at the appendix, when you look at from Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro, which then inspired 2 other books, one by the Dominican Juan Bosch, El Caribe, from Columbus to Castro, and then the book by the history book from Columbus to Castro by the Trinidadian Prime Minister Eric Williams. When you look at that, it's like in listening to you, what I hear is that he's straddling between race and class. because when you read the appendix, what it's saying is, okay, the Cubans are not black people in the sense that the rest of the West Indians are, but this is a West Indian culture. And so there is a Marxist that straddles between class and race, and he says, well, if you look at the Cuban Revolution is basically laying the path to the birth of the Caribbean or of the West Indian nation, which never happened. And that is, I think, what I think are the lessons in terms of Haiti and Cuba, because they were both made examples by the metropolis. Contrary, and I didn't think of this until I heard you today. Contrary to Africa, where both Fanon and C.L.R. James influenced, to a certain extent, the thought of the African liberation movement. That's interesting, no?
Let me just finish this, and then we can get your. Okay. So the play. This is in the last part. Okay, this is Bonaparte, enraged by the ex-slave's audacity in publishing a new Haitian constitution guaranteeing the island's self-governing dominion. Bonaparte decides to send a punitive expedition out against Toussaint under the command of Leclerc, his brother, by the way, who features in Alejo Carpentier's book, and particularly his wife, right, Pauline. Dessalines secretly encourages Leclerc in his ruse to remove Toussaint. But once his leader has been removed, he enters an alliance with the mulattoes and resumes the struggle against France. The play ends with Dessalines' victory over the French, his assumption of the title of emperor, and the beginning of his policy of eliminating all the whites in Haiti. I mean, later on then I have this famous quotation where he says that Toussaint was Dessalines could kill because he was ordinary, but what was the exact phrase? Sorry, what was the exact phrase? I can't remember that, and I can't find that quotation. The opposition between Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture, right? The Enlightenment quotation.
Yeah, enlightenment and darkness.
Yeah.
And Dessalines didn't see what was under his very nose.
So he doesn't make, and that is in line with your assessment of his change as far as violence as a means of a revolution, like propagated by somebody like Frantz Fanon is. I understand that. So he does not endorse somebody like Dessalines, because it's probably very difficult to do that. But now what for me is different from the historical documentary is a character who is the nephew of Toussaint Louverture. And now I cannot remember whether he featured that significantly in the Black Jacobins, but definitely in the play, this is my last comment. He becomes a general, and his name is Moïse, I guess Moïse, M-O-I with 2 dots, S-E. I guess the pronunciation in fact would be Moïse, not Moïse, right? No, but then it would be just a regular I. Anyway. General, okay, I say Moïse then. He is somebody in the play, in the third part, who dares to question the wisdom of his policy of maintaining the large sugar estates. That's sort of a detail, obviously, right? That's not in line with what a new leader in an independent country should be doing. Toussaint turns against his trusted nephew and orders his execution. I mean, that sort of throws a new light. And this is in the play by C.L.R. James. And I can't remember if it's in the play. But anyway, James presents Moïse as the only Haitian leader with an intellectual capacity equal to that of Toussaint, in contrast now to Henri Christophe and definitely to Dessalines. Dessalines, though he's not afraid to disagree with Toussaint, sees no further than a desire for revenge and personal power. I don't know how that matches with the actual fact. Christophe, the other educated leader, adopts a policy of opportunism, collaborating with whoever happens to hold the balance of power. Moyse, like Toussaint, is a committed Republican and an admirer of French revolutionary thought. But this does not cloud his judgment when it comes to choosing the policies which he considers best suited to Haiti's interests. Early in the play, he tells Toussaint, "We want to be free and equal. Make San Domingo independent. The people will come with us." Shortly before his execution, he urges Toussaint again to abandon his half measures, and he voices the most convincing argument against Toussaint policies. And that really sticks out in the play. The country does not know where it stands. Is slavery abolished forever, or is a French expedition coming to restore slavery? The ex-slaves don't know. The ex-slave owners don't know. I have told you to declare the island independent. Expel all those who do not want to accept it. Assure the ex-slaves that slavery is gone forever. That is what they want to know. Break up those accursed big plantations. As long as they remain, freedom is a mockery. Distribute the lands carefully among the best cultivators in the country, that everybody see that there is a new regime. I think that is C.L.R. James as a Marxist as his best, right? But it's not Toussaint Louverture who is given those lines. It's this nephew. Can you remember, does he play a role in Black Jacobins? He's very prominent in the play.
Yeah, he's in the Black Jacobins, and the whole...
Is he given lines like this? Sorry, is he given lines like this?
I would have to go back and look at the text, but it should be fairly easy. What I'd like to suggest is that we invite some questions from the audience.
Hi, Bobby, and thanks again for a great talk as the one yesterday. I just want to have a question about a whole different matter that what has been discussed, and take a branch out of the presentation in a different line towards Dr. King's role in the whole network that you have outlined. And it just comes out, I reread the Black Jacobins in 2007, remember rereading it, and it coincided, and this is a question, a curiosity that I want to pose to you based on the privilege that you have had to have access to these papers. This coincided with the, I think, with the opening of the Dr. King's library, and some anniversary of I think probably there was a lot of report in the news at that time. I was living in New Jersey at the time and teaching a Caribbean course, and I taught the Black Jacobins. And taking on what you stated at the beginning, the fact that no one is left untouched after reading this book, and I completely agree with that. And at that time, they were putting a lot of repetitions of Dr. King's speech, "I Have a Dream," which was also in 1960. So my question to you is it, and I went back to some of the passages of the Black Jacobins, and I guess my question, just to cut to the chase, my question is, that Dr. King read the Black Jacobins and, inspired by it, use it as part of some of the lines of the speech, of his speech, "If I Have a Dream," in the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, there are a few lines that I have identified that there are parallels there, and
Very interesting.
and it's something I have not heard anyone talk about it at that time. I was going to travel south to leave from Miami, and I said, well, I can stop in Atlanta and see if there is a copy of the Black Jacobins in the King's Library. The librarian there told me first that there was a copy, and then when I confirmed that I was going to go, she told me that that she was mistaken, that there was not a copy of the Black Jacobins. I checked the papers, the King papers, the ones that have been published, and that exchange that happened in '57 is there. And I think James sent him a copy of the book via some jazz player, for what I can remember of the papers which I have at home. But there's certain passages, particularly some quotes in the Black Jacobins from the London Gazette that are used as part of the book, where there are lines about the character of men, and it's basically that line, that famous line, you know, the content of the character of the man is not made
Yes.
the color of the skin and blah blah blah. So
Yeah.
it's that line and some parts, and I wonder to what extent Dr. King used them. I don't want to say plagiarized them, but sort of got inspired by them. And whether you know anything about that.
I don't. I've not examined it, but it would be very much in character with James, that he would have given a copy of the Jacobins, his book, to Dr. King. But that book comes out in '63, and whether James got it to him before the speech, it's hard to determine it, but those lines are pretty much in sort of general. It's how King wove those ideas into the speech. But I can't say that I have any firsthand insights to add to that question. But it's an interesting one.
Would you like to sort of check the lines to see whether I'm pulling it by the hair or whether it's... So he says, you know, I have a dream that my 4 little children one day will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of the character.
Yes.
The Black Jacobins, in page 180, says, obviously the blacks, like horses, dogs, cats, and some wild animals, judge a man not by the color of his skin, but by the way he behaves. But then the London Gazette report of 1798, there's another line that says, blah, 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 blah. He's a Negro, referring to Louverture, born to vindicate the claims of this species and to show that the character of a man is independent of the exterior color. So there are some coincidences there that I found interesting at that coincidence.
But I think the basic idea is quite a generic one, you know, so it would be hard to specify whether there is any direct line of or relation of influence. But it's worth thinking about. Thank you.
James L.R. Literary James. Oh yes, yes. Where James, when he theorizes, summarizing, synthesizing with Amy Cesare, has and within the context that there's a revolution, real revolution going on in Cuba, but assuming that he left his theorizing there, has someone else posteriormente, si alguien posteriormente ha hecho teorización, has someone else taken up where James has left his work with respect to a Caribbean situation and an African influence, and we're going to put on second European civilization. Has someone else taken up? Has some other intellectual taken up where James and Amy Cesare has left off?
Well,
assuming we're talking about 1980 and we're in 2015.
Yes. Well,
or has there been decay, an intellectual decay? You know, No
there
incarnation, no?
has been continuing work in the tradition of James. I would say that Walter Rodney certainly both his historical writing and in his political activism certainly continued to develop the ideas of social independence in Jamaica and in Guyana. Rodney's influence was very strong. Whether there has been intellectual decay, I would say there's been a retreat, an intellectual retreat, and the signs of it take different forms. There is a palpable sense of political defeat after the crisis and the collapse of the Grenada Revolution. From that period, 83, there's been great demoralization. And I would ask you the question, how do you see Puerto Rico? Has there been political decay and political realignment here in Puerto Rico? From what I am able to pick up, there's been considerable political realignment. So that's to be expected, but if what you're asking is there another CLR James on the horizon or at work currently? I would say probably not. Not at this time. I don't know who that person might be. But we don't need another CLR James, perhaps. We need many, many people to take up the responsibility of translating that work into new idioms. And that, I think, we are seeing very, very creative, and Lowell will know about this in, say, Trinidad, in Tunapuna. Very creative, cultural, artistic work going on, and that's what matters ultimately. But we're living in a different time from the time of CLR James. When James went back to the Caribbean in between 58 and 63, one could sense that an era was ending and a new era was beginning. We're still in the grip of that new era, but clearly something has to give.
Pues un millón de gracias a los dos. Okay. Just to finish very quickly, we've had a wonderful opportunity this afternoon to listen to the really, again, illuminating the conference, this time on CLR James and the making of the Black Jacobins, but then to have the particular comments of Reinhardt that takes us in a slightly different direction, but almost gives us the sense of a conference and a half by adding this new literary dimension, the speaking about Toussaint Louverture, the dramatic version, which precedes the narrative, the historical version, and bringing up issues of textuality and those kinds of things. But again, I want to thank the Robert Hill for sharing all of this vast experience with us, and to thank Reinhardt as well for participating in the talk. Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking with us here, okay?